What would you do if everything you spent a lifetime building was stolen right before your very eyes by your husband's mistress? Eleanor had to face that brutal reality. At the reading of the will, the beautiful young mistress smirked victoriously, while Eleanor's own son sided with the enemy. It seemed as though everything would end in humiliation. But they had underestimated the strength of a wife backed into a corner. Eleanor knew a secret, a hidden real will, and she was about to turn the courtroom into her stage for the most stunning reversal imaginable. Could a single old piece of paper truly be powerful enough to shatter the cunning mistress's meticulously crafted scheme? Promises carved in stone. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 63 years old. And for 40 of those years, I was Mrs. Sterling. I used to think I understood the weight of that name, the solid feel of it in my mouth when I made a reservation or signed a check. It meant stability. It meant permanence. I thought I knew what it meant, until the day I had to destroy my husband's memory to save my own life. The air in the lawyer's conference room was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive, false sympathy. It was the kind of room where lives were neatly sliced into paragraphs and distributed according to the final wishes of the dead. My son, Ethan, sat beside me, or rather, his body sat beside me. His spirit was somewhere else entirely, lost in a place I couldn't reach. Across the polished mahogany table sat Genevieve Thorne. She was the other woman, the one my husband, Richard, had called his investment consultant, a title that was both technically true and a profound lie. She was beautiful, in a way that seemed assembled rather than born. Sharp angles, perfect teeth, and eyes that saw everything as a transaction. Today, she wore a cream-colored suit, the color of innocence. It was a lie. Of course, everything about her was a lie, polished to a high sheen. Our lawyer, Mr. Davies, cleared his throat. He was a man who spoke in monotones, as if every word cost him something personally. He began to read from the last will and testament of Richard Sterling. My Richard, the man whose toast I scraped the burnt edges off of every morning for 40 years, the man whose socks I picked up from the floor, whose back I rubbed when his worries kept him awake. He read through the smaller bequests: a watch to a nephew, a donation to his university, and then he arrived at the heart of it, the core of our life together, and thus, the remainder of my estate. Mr. Davies read, his voice flat, including the primary residence at 12 Oak Haven Drive, the property at Lake Lanier, and all controlling shares in Sterling Developments, shall be bequeathed to my trusted partner and companion, Ms. Genevieve Thorne. The words hung in the air, not like smoke, which fades, but like stones, heavy, cold. They landed in the center of the room and stayed there. I watched Genevieve. I watched her very closely. She didn't gasp or look surprised. She simply offered a small, sad smile, a masterpiece of practiced grief. A delicate tear welled in her eye and rested there, perfect and glistening, never daring to fall and smudge her makeup. She tilted her head slightly towards Ethan, a silent gesture of shared sorrow. It was a performance, and it was flawless. Then, I turned to my son, my boy, the one I had rocked to sleep, the one whose fevers I had cooled with wet cloths through long, dark nights. He just stared at the table, at the way the light from the window caught the edge of his water glass. His shoulders were slumped, not in grief, but in acceptance. It was the acceptance that broke me more than the will itself. He had known. In that terrible, quiet moment, I understood. He had known, and he had let me walk in here completely blind, holding his arm, thinking we were facing this together. Mr. Davies looked at me with something resembling pity. Mrs. Sterling, Eleanor, I am truly sorry. My hands were trembling in my lap. I clenched them together, my knuckles turning white and bloodless. I could feel the tremor starting in my chest, a deep, rattling earthquake of rage and sorrow that threatened to shake me apart. But the sound that came out of my mouth was not a sob. It was quiet. It was steady. It was the voice of a woman who had just realized she had nothing left to lose. People often think a will is the final word, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence. But some truths, Some promises, they are carved in stone long before the last lie is ever written down. I leaned forward, my old bones protesting, and placed a worn, leather-bound folder on the table. It made a soft, solid sound, and thump. It was the only real thing in the room. Genevieve's perfect smile faltered for the first time. A tiny crack in the porcelain. "Mr." Davies looked at the folder. Then, at me. His professional calm finally ruffled. "Eleanor. What is this?" "That," I said, pushing it towards him with one finger, "is the Sterling Family Irrevocable Trust, signed by Richard and myself 35 years ago. It predates everything." I looked at Genevieve. Her face was a blank canvas now. The practiced grief wiped clean, revealing the cold calculation underneath. I looked at Ethan. He finally lifted his head from his study of the water glass. And in his eyes, I saw not defiance, but a flicker of something else. Fear. The room was silent, absolutely silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic beating of my own heart. But to understand how we got there, to that polished table, to that moment of shattering, you have to go back. You have to go back to the gray, drizzling day of the funeral, the day I buried my husband and stood at his graveside realizing I was burying a stranger. Eulogy for a stranger, funerals are for the living, they say. But as I stood at the entrance of the chapel, my hand cold as marble from shaking hundreds of others, I felt more like a ghost than anyone. The day was the color of ash. A fine, persistent drizzle hung in the air, blurring the edges of the world. It felt fitting. I wore Richard's favorite charcoal gray coat. The wool was heavy on my shoulders, a familiar weight that suddenly felt alien. Inside, my heart was a hollow space, not empty, hollow, a place where something large and solid used to be. I focused on the details. It was the only way to keep from floating away. The white lilies arranged by the altar, their scent thick and sweet like a memory you can't quite place. The dark wood of the pews, polished to a deep shine. The slightly off-key hum of the organ. People murmured their condolences. He was a great man. Eleanor. A pillar of the community. We'll all miss him. I nodded and smiled, a small, brittle smile. I was playing a part, the grieving widow. It was the last service I could perform for my husband, the man who cared so much about appearances. So I stood straight, kept my chin up, and made sure his farewell was dignified, orderly. Then I saw her, Genevieve Thorne. She didn't arrive. She made an entrance. She moved through the somber crowd like a beam of light cutting through fog. She wore a tailored forest green coat that hugged her figure, and heels that clicked softly on the stone floor. Not too high, tasteful. Her makeup was flawless, her expression a perfect mask of sorrow. She looked like a movie star playing the part of a heartbroken woman. She was captivating. I watched as people turned to look at her. They didn't know who she was. Not really. To them, she was the strategic consultant Richard had brought on a few years ago, the brilliant mind helping him expand the business. I had met her a handful of times at company events. She had always been perfectly polite, bringing me a glass of wine, asking about my garden. I had dismissed her, a sycophant, I thought. Ambitious. I never imagined she was the architect of my life's demolition. She took a seat in the front row, on the other side of the aisle from me and Ethan, close enough to be noticed, close enough to stake a claim. The service began. The minister spoke of Richard's generosity, his vision. Friends shared anecdotes. I listened to stories about a man I only vaguely recognized, the daring businessman, the charming friend. Where was the man who fell asleep on the couch with his glasses askew, the one who could never find matching socks, the one whose hand I held through 2 bouts of pneumonia? He wasn't here. They were eulogizing a stranger. Then it was Ethan's turn. My son, my tall and serious son. He walked to the podium, his dark suit impeccable. He looked so much like Richard, the same strong jaw, the same steady gaze. He unfolded a piece of paper, but he didn't look at it. He began to speak. His voice clear and strong. He spoke of his father, the man who taught him how to throw a baseball, how to read a blueprint, how to be a man of his word. My heart ached with a fierce, painful pride This was my boy. My good boy. He finished his prepared remarks. And then he paused. The silence in the chapel was absolute. He looked up, and his eyes scanned the pews until they found hers. Genevieve's, there's someone else I need to thank, Ethan said, his voice suddenly thick with an emotion I hadn't heard before. Someone who was my father's true source of strength in these last difficult years. My hands, resting in my lap, gripped my handbag. My knuckles were white. He's going to say my name, I thought. It was a foolish, desperate hope. He's going to finally see me. All the years, all the quiet sacrifices, someone, he continued, his voice trembling slightly, who understood him in a way no one else could. Ms. Genevieve Thorne? A soft murmur rippled through the chapel. It was like the sound of a stone being dropped into a deep, still well. I felt every eye in the room shift, first to Genevieve, who dabbed at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief, nodding graciously. Then, to me, the real wife, the mother, sitting alone. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body had turned to stone. The air was gone from my lungs. The sounds in the room seemed to come from a great distance. It was the most public humiliation I had ever known, delivered by my own child, after the service. At the small reception, the whispers followed me like shadows. She was sitting so close. Did you see the way he looked at her? I nodded and smiled and accepted condolences. My movements automatic, a well-oiled machine of social grace. Then I saw it. Ethan was standing with Genevieve near the window. He leaned in and whispered something to her. I couldn't hear the words. Not all of the but I didn't need to. I saw the look on his face, the adoration, the loyalty, and I heard the last few words drift across the room, clear as a bell. You're the one who's truly family. The teacup in my hand rattled against its saucer. In that moment, I understood. This funeral wasn't for Richard. It was for a world I never knew existed. And in that world, I was the stranger. I was the one who didn't belong. The devil's signature, the drive from the funeral home to the lawyer's office was short, but it felt like a journey across a vast, empty desert. The rain had stopped, leaving the Atlanta streets gleaming under a tired gray sky. Ethan drove. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. We didn't speak. The silence in the car was heavier than any words could have been. It was a silence full of things unsaid, of questions I was too afraid to ask, and answers he was unwilling to give. Mr. Davies's office was on the top floor of a glass tower in Buckhead. It was designed to make you feel small, to remind you that you were dealing with matters of great importance, money, legacy, things that felt utterly meaningless to me at that moment. We sat around that same polished mahogany table from my memory, only this time, the tension was a living thing in the room. It had a pulse. Genevieve was already there. A vision in charcoal gray. She nodded at me. A soft, sympathetic gesture that made my skin crawl. I held on to a sliver of hope. A foolish, desperate hope. I thought perhaps the will would be fair. That Richard, in his final moments, had remembered the 40 years, the life we had built, the son we had raised. I thought perhaps Genevieve would receive a generous sum, a thank you for her services. But the house, our home, the company that had been our life's work, surely, those would come to us, to family. Mr. Davies put on his reading glasses. The soft click of the arms snapping into place sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He began to read. His voice was a flat drone, listing assets like a grocery list. To my beloved son, Ethan Sterling, I bequeath the trust fund established on his 21st birthday, and my collection of vintage wristwatches. I looked at Ethan. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask, a collection of watches. That was his inheritance. The metal and glass timepieces his father had loved more than the time they had spent together. Mr. Davies continued, his voice unwavering. All remaining assets, tangible and intangible, are to be transferred to Ms. Genevieve Thorne. This includes, but is not limited to, the primary residence at 12 Oakhaven Drive. My breath caught in my throat. Our home, the place I had planted magnolias in the front yard, the kitchen where I had taught Ethan to bake cookies, his small hands covered in flour, the waterfront property at Lake Lanier, the cottage where we spent our summers, the dock where Richard had taught Ethan how to fish, the sun warm on our backs, and all controlling shares, amounting to 51% of Sterling Developments. And there it was, the final blow. The company I had helped him build from nothing, working as his bookkeeper in our tiny apartment in the early days, balancing ledgers on our kitchen table, gone. All of it, signed away with a flourish of ink. The devil's signature on the last page of my life. When he finished, a profound silence fell over the room. Genevieve lowered her head, dabbing at a non-existent tear. It was a perfect, calculated gesture of humility and victory. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't feel my hands. I was just a hollow shell sitting in an expensive chair. I turned to the only person left in the world who mattered. My son, Ethan. I whispered. The sound was ragged. He finally looked at me. His eyes were not filled with grief. They were empty, resigned. Why? Ethan, my voice trembled, betraying the calm I was trying so desperately to hold on to. Why would he do this? He took a slow breath. He spoke to me as if I were a child who couldn't grasp a simple concept. Mom, you wouldn't understand, he said, his voice low and steady. Dad did what made him happy. The words hit me like a physical blow. Happy. That one word invalidated my entire life. Happy, I asked. The word choking me. What about 40 years of marriage? What about this family? Was none of that real? Was it all built on a foundation of lies? He looked away, towards the window, towards the gray city skyline. He said, she understood him. She supported him. He finally turned back to me, and his voice dropped even lower, almost apologetically. You didn't. That was it. The final turning of the knife. I had not understood him. My 4 decades of loyalty, of sacrifice, of quiet companionship, it all amounted to a misunderstanding. I drove home alone. I don't remember much of the drive. When I walked through the front door of my house, of her house, the silence was deafening. The place was full of ghosts. Richard's favorite armchair sat empty by the fireplace. The scent of his aftershave still lingered faintly in the hallway. Every object, every photograph, every piece of furniture was a monument to a life I no longer owned. I walked from room to room, a stranger in my own home. I touched the cool marble of the kitchen countertop where we had leaned and laughed. I stood in the doorway of Ethan's old bedroom, the faint pencil marks on the doorframe still there, marking his height as he grew from a small boy into a tall man, a man I no longer recognized. I sat down at the dining room table as the sun went down, plunging the room into shadow. I didn't turn on a light. I just sat there, in the dark, feeling the full weight of my solitude. I was 63 years old, and I was utterly, completely alone. I sat there in the darkness, feeling like I was the only person in the world. If you have ever felt betrayed by the very people you love the most, please leave a comment below. Sometimes, just knowing you are not alone is a comfort in itself. I thought I would cry then. I waited for the tears, for the storm of grief and rage to finally break, but it never came. That night, I did not cry. Tears are for sadness, and what was rising in me, in the cold, quiet darkness of that house, was something else entirely. It was colder, harder. It was steel. Ghost in the archives. The eviction notice gave me 30 days. 30 days to dismantle 40 years of a life, pack it into cardboard boxes, and disappear quietly. The first few days, I did nothing. I drifted through the silent rooms like a ghost in my own home, touching the furniture, tracing the patterns on the wallpaper. I was paralyzed, drowning in the sheer injustice of it all. Then, on the 4th morning, something shifted. I woke up before the sun, and the hollow ache in my chest had been replaced by something else. A cold, hard knot. It wasn't hope. It was purpose. I had been a certified public accountant before I married Richard. I'd had a mind for numbers, for patterns, for finding the one detail that didn't fit. I gave it all up. Of course, if fatly respinsinet, have made never middle wongs. Richard had said he wanted a wife, not a business partner, and I, a fool in love, had agreed. But that part of my mind hadn't died. It had only been sleeping, and now it was stirring. Instead of packing up the kitchen, I walked into Richard's home office. The room was his sanctuary. Leather-bound books he'd never read. A heavy oak desk. A faint scent of his cologne still clinging to the curtains. For years, I had only entered to dust or bring him a cup of coffee. Now, I sat in his chair. It felt strange, too large. I ran my hand over the worn leather. Then I opened the first drawer. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A letter, another will, a confession. I just knew I couldn't leave this house without understanding why. Why Genevieve? Why was she worth the utter destruction of his family? I spent days in that office. The sun would rise and set outside the window, and I would barely notice. I went through file cabinets filled with old tax returns, business proposals, partnership agreements. It was a paper trail of a life. My hands were covered in a fine layer of dust. The dust of buried history. Most of it was just business, dry and impersonal. But I kept going, driven by an instinct I couldn't explain. The accountant in me was looking for a discrepancy, a number that was out of place. The wife in me was looking for a heart. I found it in the back of the lowest filing cabinet, in a section labeled Archive, Do Not Discard. It was a thick accordion file, brittle with age. The label on the tab simply said, Project Nightingale. I had never heard of it. I lifted it onto the desk. A small cloud of dust bloomed in the air. Inside were the documents for Richard's very first major development deal, the one that had launched his career, that had taken him from a small-time contractor to a real player. This was the foundation of everything we had. I read through the initial partnership agreement. Sterling Construction, a fledgling company, was partnering with an older, more established firm, a firm called Renaud & Sons Construction. Renaud. The name hit me like a physical blow. I stopped breathing. It couldn't be a coincidence. The world was not that small, not that cruel. My hands were shaking now, but my mind was suddenly sharp, laser-focused. I scanned the documents. The partnership was formed. Plans were drawn up. Then, things started to go wrong. There were letters from the bank citing sudden funding issues, memos from Richard detailing cost overruns and delays, all blamed on his partner, and finally, a legal document dissolving the partnership. With Sterling Construction assuming full control of the project for pennies on the dollar, the Renault company had been forced into bankruptcy, wiped out. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, my heart pounding against my ribs. I remembered a story Richard had told me years ago. Over dinner, he'd been talking about his early struggles. There was this old fa, he'd said, swirling the wine in his glass. My first partner, a man named André Renault, he got greedy, tried to cut me out, overplayed his hand and lost everything. A sad story. Really? A lesson in hubris. A lesson in hubris. He had told the story with a kind of detached pity. But looking at these documents, I saw a different story. I saw a meticulous, calculated dismantling of a man's business. I saw a betrayal, and I saw a daughter who might have grown up with the ghost of her father's failure hanging over her, a daughter who might have spent her entire life waiting for the chance to collect on a debt she believed was owed. Genevieve Thorne. Her mother's maiden name, I now realized, clever, distant enough to avoid immediate connection, but a name she could claim as her own. She hadn't just stumbled into Richard's life. She had targeted him. This wasn't a love affair. It was an assassination, carried out over years. A cold dread washed over me, colder than any grief I had felt. I had been mourning a husband who had an affair, but this was something else entirely. This was darker, older, a poison that had been seeping into the foundations of my life for decades without me ever knowing. Genevieve wasn't a new chapter in Richard's life. She was a ghost from a past he had tried to bury, and she had come back to collect. The confession in the old box. The key was cold and ornate. I'd found it tucked inside the lining of an old briefcase of Richard's, along with a single, cryptic note, Atlanta Heritage Bank, Box 317, for Ellie. If the worst happens. I hadn't known Richard even had an account there, let alone a safe deposit box. Another secret, his life, I was learning, was a house full of locked doors. The bank was one of those old downtown buildings with marble floors that echoed with every footstep. The kind of place where secrets felt safe, down in the vault. The air was cool and still. An attendant used his key, then mine, and pulled out a long, metal box. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. I took it to a small, private viewing room and closed the door. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hand resting on the cold metal lid. I was afraid to open it, afraid of what I would find, and afraid of what I would. Finally, I lifted the lid. There wasn't much inside. No stacks of cash. No hidden Eules. Just a thick manila envelope. My name, Eleanor, was written on the front in Richard's familiar, sloping handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, there was a single folded letter and a small, silver USB drive. I read the letter first. It was short. My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means I have failed. I have failed you. I have failed our son. And I have failed to escape the ghosts of my own making. I am a coward. And I am sorry. The truth is on the drive. All of it. Forgive me. Yours. Always. Richard. I plugged the USB drive into the small laptop I had brought with me. A single video file appeared on the screen. I clicked on it. Richard's face filled the screen. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. The confident mask he wore for the world was gone. This was the man I saw late at night, when he thought no one was watching. He was in his home office, the one I was now forbidden to enter. He took a deep, shaky breath and began to speak. His voice, coming through the tiny speakers, was a ghost's whisper. Ellie, he started, not looking at the camera, but at something far away. If you're seeing this, I'm gone, and I know you have questions. You deserve answers. The truth begins a long time ago. With a man named Jean-Luc Renault. My heart stopped. Renault, he was my partner. Richard continued, his voice thick with a shame I had never heard before. My friend, and I destroyed him. I saw an opportunity to take the company for myself, and I took it. I used his own weaknesses against him, pushed him out, and left him with nothing. A few months later, he took his own life. I built our entire world on the ruins of his. He finally looked at the camera, his eyes pleading. Genevieve is his daughter. She came to me years ago. A brilliant, ambitious young woman. I didn't know who she was at first. By the time I did, it was too late. She had already sunk her claws in so deep. This was never about love for her, Ellie. It was about revenge. A slow, perfect revenge. To take everything from me. Just as I had taken everything from her father, I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't an affair. It was an execution. 40 years in the making. Richard's image flickered. He looked down at his hands. But she needed leverage. Something to keep me in line. Something to ensure my silence. And she found it in Ethan. My hands flew to my mouth. A cold dread, colder than any grief, crept through me. You remember the accident? Richard said, his voice cracking. When Ethan was 18, the night he took my car, it wasn't just a fender bender. Ellie, I lied to you. He hit someone. A young man on a bicycle. The boy was badly hurt. Hospitalized for months. Ethan panicked. He drove away. I couldn't breathe. My son, my quiet, gentle son, I covered it up. Richard confessed. Tears now openly streaming down his face. I paid the family. Used my connections to make the police report disappear. I thought I was protecting him, but I was putting a chain around his neck. And Genevieve, she found that chain. She found out everything. She has been holding it over his head, over our heads, for years, forcing him to play along, forcing him to push you away. He's been living in a prison. Ellie, and I built it for him. Everything clicked into place. Ethan's distance, his coldness, his terrible, hollow acceptance in the lawyer's office. It wasn't betrayal, it was terror. She won't stop. Richard's voice was barely a whisper now. She wants to leave you with nothing. But there is one thing she doesn't know about. One thing I did right, a long time ago. He leaned closer to the camera, in the bottom drawer of the old filing cabinet in the basement. The one with the faulty lock, behind the false panel in the back. You'll find the original documents for the Sterling Family Irrevocable Trust. We signed it after Ethan was born. To protect you. To protect our future. It makes the house, the lake property, and our original shares in the company untouchable. They belong to the trust. Ellie, not to me. I couldn't sign them away even if I wanted to. He looked exhausted. A man completely broken. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to walk in. She knows almost everything. Ellie, I think she knows I'm getting ready to fight back. Be careful. Be careful with everything. Even the simple things, like the brakes on a car. The screen went black. I sat there in the silent, cold vault for a long time. The video played over and over in my head. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just falling into place. They were slamming together with brutal, unforgiving force. The affair, the will, my son's cruelty, Richard's death, they were all connected, woven together in a tapestry of deceit and revenge. This fight was no longer about money. It was no longer about a house or a company. It was about survival, and it was about my son. My son. Anger is a hot, roaring fire. It burns brightly and then it burns out. But the truth is a cold, heavy stone. And for 3 days, I carried that stone inside me. I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't call Ethan. I just sat with it, letting its weight settle into my bones. I knew that when I finally faced my son, it could not be with the fire of a betrayed wife. It had to be with the strength of a mother. I asked him to meet me at a small coffee shop downtown called the Bluebird Cafe. It was an old place, with worn wooden floors and the constant, comforting scent of roasted coffee beans. We used to go there on Saturday mornings when he was a little boy. I would buy him a hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, and he would tell me all his 7-year-old secrets. I chose it on purpose. I needed to remind him, and perhaps myself, that before all of this, we were a family. He was already there when I arrived. Sitting at a small table in the back, he looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he kept turning his phone over and over in his hands, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a teenager. He looked up when I approached, his expression guarded. Wary, I sat down and didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at him. My son, the boy whose face I knew better than my own. I saw the man he had become, the successful architect. But underneath, I could still see the little boy with the chocolate smudge on his cheek. Finally, I spoke. My voice was softer than I expected. I know you've been carrying a heavy burden. Ethan, I said, you've been carrying it alone for far too long. I'm here now. Let me help you. He flinched, as if expecting an attack. Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my purse and took out my tablet. I placed it on the table between us and pressed play. It was the video from the safe deposit box. Richard's face filled the small screen. Older, grayer, and more weary than I had ever seen him. I didn't watch the video. I watched Ethan. At first, his face was a mask of confusion. As his father's voice began to speak, confessing the sins against Andre Renault, Ethan's jaw tightened. He was angry. Angry on his father's behalf, ready to defend his memory. But then, Richard started talking about the accident, about a rainy night 15 years ago, about a teenage boy behind the wheel. I saw the color drain from Ethan's face. His whole body went rigid. His eyes were locked on the screen. But he wasn't just seeing a video anymore. He was seeing a ghost. Richard's voice, tinny and full of regret, filled the quiet space between us. He spoke of the cover-up, the money, the threats. He spoke of how he had used his own son's mistake, a moment of youthful terror, as a chain to bind him. Then he spoke Genevieve's name. He explained how she had found out, how she had used that same chain to control not just him, but Ethan too. The video ended. Richard's face disappeared, replaced by a black, silent screen. Ethan didn't move. He just stared at the blank tablet, his breathing shallow. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, then another. He didn't make a sound. It was the silent, convulsive grief of someone who had held it in for a lifetime. He lowered his head until his forehead was resting on his clasped hands on the table, and his shoulders began to shake. The wall he had built around himself, brick by brick, over 15 years, it had crumbled into dust. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his arm. He flinched at my touch, then relaxed into it. "She knew," he whispered, his voice muffled. "From the beginning, she had a private investigator. She found the old police report, the one Dad buried. She found the man I hit." He lifted his head, and his eyes were filled with a shame so profound it was like a physical wound. "He lived, Mom. The man I hit, he lived, but he was never the same. Dad paid for everything. His silence, his medical bills, everything. He said it was the only way to protect me. But it wasn't protection. It was a cage. He told me everything. How Genevieve had approached him a year ago, showing him the file she had compiled. She didn't threaten him outright. She was smarter than that. She framed it as a shared secret, a way to protect Richard's legacy. She made Ethan her accomplice, poisoning his mind against me, telling him I was weak, that I wouldn't understand, that I would fall apart if I knew the truth about the two men I loved. He was trapped between the ghost of his father's sin and the weight of his own. When he finished, the coffee shop was quiet around us. The story hung in the air, ugly and heavy. I looked at my son, at the broken man sitting in front of me, and I felt no anger, only a deep, aching love. "That wasn't your father protecting you, Ethan," I said softly. "That was him protecting himself. And that wasn't Genevieve protecting his legacy. That was her destroying his family. And it ends now." I squeezed his arm. "I am not going to let her ruin your life anymore." For the first time since the funeral, Ethan looked directly into my eyes. The wary, guarded look was gone. In its place was a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years. "Hope. We are going to face this," I said, my voice firm. "Together," he nodded. A slow, strange, a word. Deliberate movement. A promise. In the quiet corner of that little coffee shop, over the ghosts of 1,000 hot chocolates, I got my son back. The woman in white. The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet, focused activity. The woman who used to spend her afternoons tending to her roses was now spending them in strategy sessions with a new, sharper lawyer. My old self, Mrs. Sterling, was gone. In her place was Eleanor Hayes, a former bookkeeper with a calculator for a brain and a heart forged in fire. We filed the motion to contest the will, citing the supremacy of the irrevocable trust. The legal papers went back and forth, a volley of sterile, jargon-filled documents that felt completely disconnected from the raw, human mess they represented. Genevieve felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, and when a snake feels threatened, it begins to strike. The threats were subtle at first. A car driving slowly past my house late at night. Phone calls with nothing but silence on the other end of the line. Then, they became more direct. One of her lawyers sent a letter to mine, casually mentioning their deep concern for Ethan's emotional well-being and how the stress of a public trial might force certain unfortunate past events into the light. It was blackmail. Dressed up in a $1,000 suit, they thought I would be scared. They thought the old Eleanor, the one who lived for propriety and feared scandal, would back down to protect her son's reputation. They didn't understand. They were threatening a woman who had already walked through fire. A little smoke wasn't going to make her flinch. I decided it was time we spoke, face to face. I was tired of hiding behind lawyers. I called her office and left a message. "Tell Ms. Thorne that Eleanor Sterling would like to meet her for lunch. The Four Seasons. Tomorrow at 1. I chose the location deliberately. It was her kind of place. Expensive, elegant, and full of people who judged you by the label on your handbag. I wanted to meet her on her own territory. She arrived exactly on time. A vision in a stark white dress. It was a bold choice, the color of purity, of angels, on her. It looked like the color of a predator, a white wolf moving silently through the snow. She smiled as she sat down. The same practiced, perfect smile. "Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "There's no pleasure here, Genevieve," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I didn't touch the menu. I came here to tell you to stop." She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Stop what?" "Dear, I'm simply trying to carry out Richard's final wishes. Stop threatening my son," I said. The smile never left her face, but her eyes went cold. "As cold as a winter sky? I have no idea what you're talking about. I only wish for what's best for Ethan. He's been through so much." "You have been the so much he's been through," I replied, my voice dropping lower. "For years, you used him. You tortured him. And now you think you can use his past to scare me into submission. You think I will sacrifice my home, my future, to protect a secret that has already eaten away at his soul for more than a decade." She picked up her water glass, her movements slow and deliberate. "A mother's love is a powerful thing," she mused, "but so is a mother's shame." I leaned forward slightly. The clatter of silverware and polite chatter of the restaurant faded away. For a moment, it was just the two of us. Two queens on a chessboard. The final moves of the game laid out between us. "You took my husband," I said, my voice even, each word placed with care. "You are trying to take my home. You have tormented my son for years, using him as a pawn in a game of revenge he never asked to play. Tell me, Genevieve, after all that, what in the world do you think I have left to lose?" I watched the realization dawn in her eyes, the slow, creeping understanding that the woman sitting across from her was not the fragile, heartbroken widow she had dismissed at the funeral. The most dangerous person in the world, I finished softly, is the one who has nothing left to lose. I stood up, my chair making no sound on the thick carpet. I left my napkin, untouched, on the table. "Enjoy your lunch," I said. I walked out of that restaurant, leaving her sitting there in her white dress, the perfect smile finally gone from her face. I knew the final battle was coming. I knew it would be ugly, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. If you're still listening, comment the word yes or share something you'd like with us below. That way I'll know you're still walking with me through this story. The truth speaks. The courtroom was a cold, impersonal space. Everything was wood and marble, designed to make a person feel small, insignificant. For the first hour, it worked. Genevieve's lawyer, a sharp man with a voice as smooth and hard as river stones, was masterful. He painted Richard's will not just as a legal document, but as a love story, a testament to a man who had finally found true companionship in his later years. He presented Genevieve as the worthy recipient of that love, a partner in business and in life. He made my 40 years of marriage sound like a quiet, dusty prelude to the main event. He was very, very good. I sat beside my lawyer, Sarah, and listened. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my back straight. I could feel Genevieve's eyes on me from across the room. She was radiating confidence. She thought she had already won. She thought I was just a sad old woman, clinging to the scraps of a life that was no longer mine. When it was Sarah's turn, she didn't start with fire. She started with facts. She was a calm woman, my lawyer, and she spoke in a clear, measured voice. She presented the Sterling family irrevocable trust to the court. Genevieve's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is an old, irrelevant document. The deceased's final wishes are clearly stated in his last will and testament." The judge, a woman with tired eyes and an expression that said she had seen everything, peered down over her glasses. "I'll be the judge of what's irrelevant. Counselor, please continue." "Ms. Chen," Sarah continued. She walked the court through the trust, clause by clause. She explained how it was established 35 years ago, how it protected the core assets of our shared life, the house, the foundational stocks of the company. She proved, with meticulous documentation, that those assets were never Richard's to give away. They belonged to the trust. They belonged to the family. I could see the first hairline crack appear in Genevieve's composure. Her lawyer was whispering furiously to her. They had been blindsided, but Sarah wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a new authority. "We have one more witness. The prosecution calls Mr. Ethan Sterling to the stand." A gasp went through the courtroom. It was quiet, but I heard it. I saw Genevieve jolt in her chair as if struck by lightning. Her head whipped around to look at Ethan, who was already rising from his seat in the gallery. Her face, for the first time, was not a mask of practiced elegance. It was a canvas of pure, undiluted shock. My son walked to the witness stand. He looked so tall, so vulnerable. He sat down and swore the oath, his hand trembling slightly. But his voice was clear. Sarah began gently. "Mr. Sterling, could you please tell the court about your relationship with Ms. Genevieve Thorne?" And so, he did. He started with the funeral. He admitted, his voice thick with shame, that he had praised her at the expense of his own mother. Then he told them why. He told them about a rainy night 15 years ago. He told them about a mistake, a terrible, life-altering mistake. He told them about the secret he had carried ever since. His voice never wavered, even when he spoke of the man whose life he had changed forever. It was a confession, raw and painful, in a room full of strangers. Then he spoke of Genevieve. He told the court how she had discovered his secret. He explained how she had used it, not with overt threats, but with the subtle, poisonous suggestion that they were allies, bound together to protect Richard's legacy. He submitted emails, text messages, evidence of how she had manipulated him, coached him on what to say, and isolated him from me. He laid the entire ugly conspiracy bare. He even detailed how she had instructed him to transfer funds from company accounts into her private consulting firm. Fraud. Clear and simple. When he finished, the silence in the courtroom was profound. He had not only cleared his conscience, he had handed the court Genevieve's entire scheme on a silver platter. Genevieve's lawyer tried to object, tried to discredit him, but the damage was done. And then, Genevieve herself sealed her fate. She stood up, her face twisted with fury. "He's lying," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Ethan. "All of it. He's a spoiled, pathetic boy trying to cover for his own crimes." The judge banged her gavel. "Ms. Thorne, you will sit down." But Genevieve couldn't stop. The mask was gone. The elegant, grieving companion was gone. All that was left was a cornered, desperate woman. "He's the criminal here, not me. He should be in jail." It was over. Everyone in the room saw her for what she was. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. She upheld the terms of the family trust, immediately invalidating the key bequests of Richard's will. The house, the company, they were safe. They were mine. But she didn't stop there. Citing Ethan's testimony and the evidence of financial misconduct, she formally requested that the district attorney's office open a criminal investigation into Genevieve Thorne for fraud and possible extortion. I looked at Genevieve. She sank back into her chair, her face ashen, defeated. I looked at Ethan. He was looking at me, his eyes filled with tears. But for the first time in a long time, he looked free. I took a deep breath. The first full, clean breath I had taken in months. It was the breath of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side. The truth hadn't just been heard, it had roared. Ashes and blooms. Victory is a loud, ringing sound in a courtroom. But in the quiet of your own home, it sounds a lot like silence. A deep, hollow silence where the storm used to be. After the trial, after the reporters and the well-wishing phone calls faded away, that silence was what Ethan and I were left with. We had won. We had our home, our company, our future. But we were standing in the wreckage of our past, and the task of cleaning it up seemed monumental. There was no sense of triumph, no joy in Genevieve's downfall, which was swift and absolute. She faced criminal charges, her reputation destroyed. I found I didn't think of her at all. My thoughts were consumed with the two men who had shaped my life, one dead, one sitting across the kitchen table from me, looking as lost as I felt. One rainy Saturday, I pulled out a dusty box of old photo albums. Ethan and I sat together for hours, not saying much at first, just turning the thick, plastic-covered pages. There was Richard, young and impossibly handsome, smiling at me on our wedding day. There he was, holding a tiny, bundled Ethan, his face a mixture of terror and overwhelming love. There he was at company picnic, at birthdays, on vacations, a lifetime captured in glossy squares. He loved us, Ethan said, his voice quiet, tracing the outline of his father's face in a photo of them fishing at the lake. I know he did. How could the same man who taught me how to tie a hook be the man who used me to cover his lies? I looked at the photograph, at the ghost of the man I loved, because he wasn't one man. Ethan, I said, the truth finally settling in my heart. Not with anger, but with a deep, weary sadness. He was two, the man who loved his family, and the man who was terrified of his own failures. The protector and the tyrant, the good man and the weak man. They lived inside the same body, and in the end, the weak man made the choices. We talked for a long time that day. We talked about the good memories and the bad ones. We didn't try to make sense of it all, or to forgive him. Not yet. We just acknowledged him, all of him, the beautiful and the broken. A few weeks later, Ethan came to me. He was wearing a suit, and his face had a calm resolve I hadn't seen before. Mom, he said, I have to do something. I can't build a future on a foundation of lies. Not anymore. He told me he had found the family of the young man he had hit all those years ago. The young man had survived, but with injuries that had altered the course of his life. Ethan had hired his own lawyer, not to defend him, but to help him confess. He was ready to face whatever consequences came his way. He wasn't seeking their forgiveness. He told me he didn't deserve it. He was seeking to finally take responsibility, to lift the weight that had been crushing him for more than a decade. I had never been prouder of him in my entire life. As my son was finding his own difficult path to healing, I found mine. I went back to the offices of Sterling Developments. It felt strange to be there. The name Sterling felt like a coat that no longer fit. I knew I couldn't run the company. Not in the way Richard had, but I knew numbers. I knew value. And I knew what I had to do. I sold off a portion of the company's assets. The flashy, high-risk projects Richard had loved. With the proceeds, I established a foundation, not a Sterling Foundation. I named it the Hayes Initiative, after my mother, a woman who had taught me that a woman's worth was not tied to a man's name. The foundation's purpose was simple: to provide pro bono legal aid to elderly women who were being cheated out of their homes and their savings. Women who, like me, had woken up one day to find their lives signed away by a man they had trusted. The day the first donation check from the foundation was sent, Ethan and I did something together. The old magnolia tree in the front yard, the one I had planted when we first moved in, had withered during the long months of the legal battle. Neglected. It was dead. We spent the afternoon digging it up, our hands sore, our backs aching, and, in its place, we planted a new one. A small, sturdy sapling. As we packed the dark, rich earth around its base, I looked up at our house. It was just a house. Wood, brick, and glass. But it was ours. Not because of a name on a deed, but because of what we had survived within its walls. We watered the little tree. It looked so small and fragile in the big yard, but I knew it had good roots, and I knew, with a little time and a little care, it would bloom. The last lesson. It's been over a year now. The seasons have turned, and the world has kept moving, as it always does. The house on Oakhaven Drive is still quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet now. It's not the hollow silence of loss. It's the peaceful quiet of a space that is wholly my own. Genevieve Thorne was convicted of fraud. I read about it in the newspaper. Her picture was on the third page. A grainy black and white photo. She looked small, stripped of her expensive suits and her perfect composure. She was just another woman whose schemes had unraveled. I felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. She was simply a chapter that was finally, blessedly closed. The foundation I started, the Hayes Initiative, now has a small office in a modest building downtown. It's not much to look at yet, just a few desks, a coffee machine that sputters, and a window that looks out over the city. But from this window, I watch people on the streets below, each with their own stories, their own silent battles, and I feel a sense of purpose that I haven't felt in a very long time. We help women like me, who find themselves tangled in legal knots they never expected, fighting for lives they spent decades building. Sometimes I think about Richard. not with anger anymore. The anger has faded, leaving behind a more complicated kind of sorrow. He tried to build an empire for his son, brick by brick, deal by deal. But in his effort to give Ethan a world without struggle, he taught him how to hide the truth. I've come to realize that the greatest inheritance a parent can leave a child isn't a building made of steel and glass. It's a foundation of honesty. Once that foundation cracks, everything built on top of it is destined to fall. And Ethan, my son, is learning to rebuild. He faced his past with a courage I could only admire. The law was lenient, citing the years of coercion. But he didn't want leniency. He wanted to make amends. He sought out the man from that rainy night so long ago, and he is helping to care for him. He is rebuilding his own life on a new foundation. He had to learn a painful lesson, that loving a parent doesn't mean you have to carry the weight of their sin. True maturity, I think, is when you can finally draw a line in the sand and say, I love you, but I cannot walk with you down this wrong road. He is a good man, a better man than his father, because he chose the harder path. He chose the truth. This modern world we live in, it loves a good story. It loves the polished surfaces, the perfect smiles on social media, the illusion of effortless success. Genevieve was a master of that illusion. She built a life that looked perfect from the outside. But my story, our story, is a reminder of something else. It's a reminder that the truth is often messy, it's complicated, and it rarely shouts. The truth usually whispers, while the lies scream for attention. But in the end, only the truth has the power to heal, to set you free, and to give you the chance to begin again. The magnolia tree we planted in the front yard now has small, determined buds clinging to its branches, a promise of spring, a promise of life continuing. For 40 years, I was Mrs. Sterling. The name was like a heavy coat I wore, a role I played. It defined who I was in the world. The wife of Richard, the mother of Ethan. Now, when people ask my name, I smile. A real smile. One that reaches my eyes. You can call me Eleanor. I say, just Eleanor. And for the first time in a very long time, that name is more than enough. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder that it is never, ever too late to find your voice and rewrite your own ending. She didn't just win a court case, she won back her life. This makes me want to ask you all, what was a moment in your life when you discovered a strength you never knew you had? Share your story in the comments. Your experience could be the very thing someone else needs to hear today. If you believe in the power of a second chapter, show it with a like, and share this story to inspire someone else, and to ensure you're part of our community of survivors and storytellers. Subscribe to Deepu Kader Stories. Thank you for listening. And remember, everyone has a story waiting in the archives of their life. Perhaps the next one we uncover will feel like your own.